Hi, I'm Neil Sheridan. I'm the Executive Director of the Michigan Townships Association with this week's webcast and our series MTA Q&A. Today, Catherine Mullhaupt, our MTA Staff Counsel, and our MIS Member Information Services Director, Michael Selden, will be discussing the executive order that the Governor recently released on Freedom of Information Act requests. The order allows for greater flexibility in timing and in fulfilling these requests. So, this is a short part of what we're trying to educate our members on as the impacts of the coronavirus situation become more clear on our operations and the expectations that people have of our services.
Hello and welcome. I'm Mike Selden, and I'm here with Catherine Mullhaupt again, our staff attorney, and we are going to discuss with you a little bit about the executive order that relaxed the rules a little bit on FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act request. Executive Order number 38, 2020-38 is the order that was released Sunday evening that does help relax the rules on fulfilling FOIA for some FOIA requests. So Catherine's here with me, and she's going to explain a little bit about what that what that executive order does, and then we'll talk a little bit more about how that affects you and your request.
Hi, Mike.
Hi, Catherine.
Good to see you again. Yes, Mike was describing this is Executive Order 38 or 2020-38. It took effect on April 5th. It goes through midnight on June 4th, so until June 5th. This is a temporary suspension of part, but not all of the FOIA requirements. So let me start right off the bat. You do still have a requirement to respond to some degree, Freedom of Information Act requests. And the same as you always would in terms of understanding that there are deadlines, and people do have a right to request to see or receive copies of public records. Now, what it does do is change some of the time frames you have to answer a person's request. And the first thing that it did was, if the request comes in email, this is not changed. If it comes in email and you're able to respond in email, go right ahead, because there's no exposure. And ultimately, remember, the whole purpose of this is not to restrict a person's right to request public information in a public record, but to keep everyone safe, township personnel as well as the requester. And so we're looking at this from the perspective of the governor's stay-at-home orders, the various orders restricting most people's ability to go out and to interact in person. So if you receive a FOIA request by email, and it's something that you can email the records back to them, you go right ahead and nothing has changed. However, if the request comes in by mail or fax or hand delivery, I'm assuming hand delivery would be someone sticking it through a slot, because I'm not sure you would be open for business right now. But if it comes in one of those three ways, regular mail, snail mail, fax, or hand delivery, then the clock starts ticking on the day that the person for the township, whoever is responsible for responding to those, opens that mail, fax, or opens what was dropped off. Then you have 10 business days, not the 5 business days, but 10 business days in which to send your written response in one of the ways required by the Freedom of Information Act. That doesn't apply to email. Email, you still have 5 business days to respond. So also, no one is required to go to the hall and check the mailbox or check the fax machine or a slot or a drop box. No one is required to do that unless, again, remember, the board has to designate someone as essential, basically the critical infrastructure worker, to release them from the governor's order, to put them under an exception to the governor's order to leave their home and go to a place of business, because we're not supposed to be doing that right now. So no one is required to check on a daily basis the mailbox or at the office. unless you have a home office and you get it, you still have the 10 business days to send out the initial response. Again, nothing has changed if the request comes in by email. The other thing that this did was suspend the timeline, the limit that you have. You have 5 business days to respond in writing, and one of the ways to do that always has been to take a 10 business day extension. So that gives you 15 business days to respond. And again, especially for any of you who haven't heard my workshops, it's not Joe business days, it's Monday through Friday that isn't a holiday. So it doesn't matter what your township's business days are or what you consider your business days. It's always been Monday through Friday that isn't a holiday. Well, normally you have the 5 business days, and then one of the things you could send in a response is a written notice of taking 10 additional business days on top of the 5 to respond. That has been extended to some degree. Again, if you can do it by email, you go ahead and follow the normal schedule. But if you can't, if it's something where what they're asking for would be you have to go someplace to make copies, or you have to go someplace to retrieve the documents to make copies, or they were actually asking to inspect, which means they could come to a township facility and spend time seeing and going through the documents, you now may defer that indefinitely, no longer than June 5th, no longer than that. But you can actually go beyond the 10-day extension, go beyond the total 15 business days to defer that if it's going to involve staff going out or allowing someone to come in, for example, to a township facility. That's not happening right now. Nobody's supposed to be leaving home under the governor's stay-at-home order. So those are the extensions. Then there is some notice requirements you always would have to send, but you are now able to, the order spells out which of those sections, what notices you can now send to say we're taking these additional extensions in time. That's just a very, very brief description. Mike, did you have any questions you wanted to pose?
Yeah, so I think one question on this is we talk a lot about, and as the order comes out, I'm talking about it's different if you receive it by email because you're not touching anybody, touching anything. It's just email and you can send it back out. Now, what happens if I only get my email? I've got my township email address and I only receive that in the office, but I'm not going to the office. So how does this order affect that? Is it when I receive the email, or is it when the email was sent? Because I might, if I don't go in the office, I might not get my email for a few days or a week or however long it might be until I go in and see it.
Okay, so first of all, again, the extension on when you start the clock ticking does not apply to email responses. However, as you say, now we like to think that everyone can access any of their email accounts remotely, but no, not everybody can or is familiar with doing that. So if you would have to go somewhere and you're not essential person, critical infrastructure worker as designated by the township, and you can't go to the hall, then you look at the second extension, not the when the clock starts ticking, but you do have the additional response time. So beyond the first 5 or the total of 15, you now can defer indefinitely, but no later than June 5th, the ability to respond because you were not exempt from the governor's order to stay at home if you truly cannot access your email. Now, if you are able to access your email, it should be business as usual from a township perspective, and you should do this anytime, checking the email, because even a trustee or someone else who doesn't necessarily think of themselves as the FOIA coordinator could very well be getting what is a FOIA request in email and not realize they should be turning it over to whoever would be fulfilling it if it wasn't them. So the deadline to respond would be extended if you had to go someplace under the governor's order where you couldn't go, or you had, there were other restrictions because of the COVID, or you are sick, or you are exposed, for example, then you don't have to go to the hall and find your email and check your email because of this. It's not the first part. It's not the extension of the time to respond, though. It's how long you can extend what you're going to send out to them.
Okay. And just to be clear too, for myself and those watching, if you do receive a FOIA in person, if, say the clerk is the FOIA coordinator and a FOIA request comes in the mail and they do receive it, the 10-day extension does fill in or start at that time, but it starts at that time when it is received. So it doesn't extend that out. It gives you more time to respond to it, but the clock still does start ticking on that response when I do receive in that letter.
Right. So to take that one step further, what we're really talking about is then if the request came in by mail or fax or in person, right off the bat, we have a longer time frame to start the clock ticking. It comes down to when someone is safely, and according to the township's policy of who can go to the facility or whatever, when the person opens it or receives it, takes it off the fax, that is extended, potentially no more than 10 business days. But then if the person, for example, was asking, I'd like to come and inspect these records, well, then we go to the second part of the governor's extension, which is that could be extended even beyond that deadline or the normal FOIA deadlines. It can be indefinitely extended to June 5th. So that would be the earliest. Let's put it the other way around. The earliest I could put in a FOIA request and expect to go to the hall, for example, and see the documents and look at them there, in theory, would be June 5th. Now that's assuming all orders are lifted. At this point, we're not expecting that. So there could be potential additional extensions. But yeah, there are, depending on how you receive it, the township could have quite a long time through June 5th initially until we hear from other executive orders to respond.
Okay. And so in your professional opinion too, when we're looking at this, if say I'm the clerk and I am the FOIA coordinator and I receive one of these FOIA requests in while I'm in the office, and it's something that I can fulfill there. So maybe they're asking for copies of some property record that I have access to. It's right there in the hall and I can go get that and do it. Would your recommendation be to go ahead and fulfill that request? I think we still have to, but I'm trying to verify, do I still need to fulfill that request, or can I take that extension because I do have to go find documents and send those out? Or do I need to fulfill that as I normally would, taking the extra time into consideration?
Okay, so the ability to extend to June 5th for the materials is based on any COVID-19 restrictions, like the governor's stay-at-home order. If you have a home office or you have access via email or server to the documents, if you can respond by adding some files, attaching a file to an email and emailing it back to the person, well, you're going to do that, and all the time frames apply. Now, if you have the documents there and you can make copies in your home office, you can, but you're not going to be letting the person know they can come pick it up because they're still under the executive order. And if someone was asking for it to be mailed to them, well, you're still going to have to look at who you are and whether the township has designated you as critical infrastructure worker necessary and whether that's part of your job, as to whether you go to the post office or have to leave your home to take it somewhere else to have it sent. I think at this point you have to look then at that second time extension where, because of any rules or orders or issues with your health because of the coronavirus, that can be deferred until, at this point, at the earliest, June 5th. But if you can do it from your home, go ahead and do it. Electronically is the best. Now, understand there were changes made to the statute, to the Open Meetings Act in 2018. If people remember the Emily request, we did have amendments to the statute that changed what information the requester has to put in their initial request. And they do have to provide you with a phone number or an email, as well as their USPS postal address. Regardless of how they're looking to get it, they have to include that information. So in theory, most people should be, even if you get it via the mail or the fax, you're going to have an email included with that or a phone number. So if for some reason someone's requesting these things and you don't have a place to send a notice, for example, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to mail the notice out. Well, call them and get an email. Most people should be able to still put mail in like their home mail box or whatever, but something might be different.
And with that, and that might get beyond this order a little bit into more FOIA law, but pertaining to this executive order and using that, if somebody sends in a request, and maybe it's a request by email, but they're asking for a mailed copy or something, or you receive a written request for information, and they're asking for it to be mailed back, and maybe you don't have access to be able to mail it at the time, you can't go to the post office or whatever it may be, you can't make copies of it, but you have access to be able to email it to them. Could you reach out to them and ask them and say, I can't get to it right now to mail it, but can I go ahead and email this to you because I can do it electronically if you'd like it that way. Otherwise, you'll have to wait for me to mail it. Can you ask for them to change how they're requesting it?
Right. Good question. And the answer is always you've been able to, and I strongly encourage it now. Yes, you can negotiate with the requester. You can always ask and say, would you agree to an extension of the time frame? In theory, that could even be beyond the June 5th right now. And you've always had this ability. I've literally had people tell me, oh, the requester, was in Florida for 6 weeks. And they said, sure, no problem. Get it to me in 6 weeks. As long as they sign off in writing that they're agreeing to you doing something different. Absolutely. And so right now, that's more important than ever to at least notify the person immediately in writing, or if you have to call them and get them to send you an email or whatever so you can correspond, so you can explain things, you can give them notice, but also they can agree to something else. And one of the things in the executive order is that, for example, let's say I was the requester and I wanted the last 3 months of the board meeting minutes emailed to me, but I also wanted to inspect certain records. Well, the order allows you to ask them, to notify them, okay, I'm emailing you here right now the last 3 sets of minutes. They're in digital format. But what you're asking for, due to the coronavirus restrictions, we're not able to access those files or get them to you, and we're certainly not able to give you the time, the exposure at all to review them. But you could remove that part of the request. So we're good with this part of the request, and then that part is not causing a denial on the rest of it. It's really up to you. This is customer service. The Freedom of Information Act is a requirement. It is a mandate. The public does have a right to know information about how the government is doing what it's doing. But this is also an opportunity for customer service, because sometimes when people are sending FOIA requests, they're doing it because they have a concern, or maybe they're not happy with what's happening with the township. So the more you can answer from a customer service perspective, explain what's happening, explain, yes, we will be able to provide you with this information, but there will be a delay. I think under the current circumstances, most people are going to understand. But yeah, you can always negotiate the timeframes.
Yeah, and I think that's important for people to understand too, and not just during this time, but during all times, that you're here working for the people. They've elected you to represent them and to work for them and be there and be the face of them, not to work against them or try to put up roadblocks. And Certainly being transparent is an important part of that. Things can be difficult now, but I think this executive order does help provide some assistance and some leniency in that to allow us to be as safe as possible, but also try to be as transparent and open with our residents as we can be.
Right. I agree. And I think that's a good closing note that, again, the governor respects the Freedom of Information Act and the right of the public to know. And so that there was no blanket suspension of the Freedom of Information Act, just certain parts to allow both the township personnel and the requesters to remain safe under the executive orders.
Yeah. And I think unless you have something else, Catherine, I think we will wrap it up for this version, this episode on FOIA, and we will probably be seeing you back here sometime soon for another episode. So in lieu of signing off like Mr. Rogers does and singing a song, we'll just go ahead and wrap it up and say till next time. We'll talk to you later.